O God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A rare day of blindingly brilliant sunshine, slightly exhausted feet, and a cloudless blue sky such as I have never seen, accompanied me at perhaps the holiest place on earth, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. After a long and crowded walk along the Via Dolorosa, the last steps of Christ, beginning with his trial at Pilate's palace, we arrived here, the place where Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried, as we describe it in the Apostles' Creed. Just as Jesus' disciples diligently followed Jesus to the cross and eagerly checked the tomb 3 days later, I too had made my own pilgrimage to this sacred spot. It looks a bit different today, I imagine, than it did then. The crucifixion site is almost cluttered with silver lamps and golden statues, completely loaded with bling, as one of my fellow travelers put it. The tomb had received the same treatment. Icons, paintings, candles, vases full of roses and lilies. We stopped to ask ourselves, is this really it? In the midst of all this shiny splendor, we were hoping to have a magical experience, a miraculous feeling of divine presence. As you may be able to tell, that's not exactly how it went. I mean, we had touched all the things you were supposed to touch. The place where the cross was, the stone where they washed and prepared his body, the tomb itself. And yet all we really wanted to do was go sit outside on the steps and soak up the sunshine until it was time for our group to leave. So that's what we did. A bit like the men heading towards Emmaus, disappointed over unmet expectations, we left the darkened, crowded church, walked right past the scores of the faithful who had made similar pilgrimages, and sat on the steps in the yellow sun. While outside, my friends and I began to talk with a woman on our trip. Her name's Jody, and Jody was telling us about her life at home, her 3 small children, her 2-point parish in northern Wisconsin, and her husband. She told us a story of how her husband was in a bad accident 9 years ago, working as an electrician, and how he had been on disability since his accident. He's good with the kids, she told us, but sometimes he feels like another child. He doesn't like going out. He has trouble socializing. We listened to her story out there on those steps. We shared with her our sympathy and our empathy, but most importantly, we just listened to her stories about the meaningful people in her life and the everyday troubles that she faced. That night in our group time, Jody spoke up. She said, "You know, as we were at the church today, the only thing I could think of was when Jesus asks, 'Why do you seek the living among the dead?'" A text which comes right before our story for today. She continued to explain that, like the rest of us, she was expecting a holy and magical encounter at the church. I mean, who wouldn't have expected that? But she told us how she had felt God's presence most as she was sitting on those steps, talking with fellow believers and sharing in community. It took me a trip to Israel to start to learn what our story today is trying to teach us. The beauty of the resurrection is that God's presence has been set loose in the world. No longer is Jesus confined to a tomb. You can go look for yourself, but he's not there. Cleopas and his friend went to go look 2,000 years ago. Jody and I went to go look last January. Instead, Jesus is busy running amok. Jesus lives with us, in us, and among us, even though we don't always recognize him. You see, Cleopas, Jody, you and I, we all have the same problem. We know exactly where Jesus should be, don't we? We know what he will look like, what he would do, where to go searching. I mean, we read the Bible, right? The prophecies told Cleopas and company what to expect. They did everything right, but Jesus messed it up somehow. They were hoping that he was the one to redeem Israel. He said he'd be raised from the dead after 3 days. But they looked in the tomb and it was empty. And suddenly their hopes and dreams were empty too. Jody and I went to the tomb ourselves, hoping that in a world as messy as ours, that a spiritual light switch would be flicked on. Maybe if we touched the spot where the cross was, maybe if we stood in the long line to spend a couple of moments in that tomb, then we'd find Jesus for sure, beyond a doubt. So where do you go looking for Jesus? Maybe it's not all the way in Israel. Maybe it's in your personal devotion time. Maybe it's in the Bible. Maybe it's in Christian radio. And I'm not saying that those are bad places to encounter Jesus. I'm just saying, what if you come up dry? Those are all good and likely places to encounter Christ. I mean, if Jesus were to be anywhere, wouldn't you think that Jerusalem would be a good spot to start looking? But in this hide-and-go-seek game of finding Jesus, what if instead we wait, invite, even expect Jesus to find us? Isn't that what happened to the men in today's story? Isn't that what happened to Jody in Jerusalem? The thing is, Jesus shatters our expectations. He blows right past them. We are indeed foolish and slow of heart if we refuse to look beyond what we think we know about who Jesus is and where to find him. When we truly encounter Christ, he opens our minds and explains further about himself and his ministry. He expands the ideas we've held and invites us to think beyond what we know. I've got some news for you. The risen Christ is among you, is among us. He's the guy walking next to you. Jesus lives with us, in us, and among us. The only problem is that we haven't always the eyes to see it. We are invited today to be more creative and imaginative about recognizing Jesus in our midst. We begin to see God in the ordinariness of our everyday lives, in sharing a meal of bread and wine, walking down the street, a kind word spoken in times of grief. When I had just turned 8 years old and my sister was barely 5, my grandfather died. It was my mother's first loss of a parent. She was only 33 and felt much too young to be fatherless. At the time, my sister and I shared a room, and in the middle of the night, Mom came in to wake up Allie and I to tell us that Grandpa had died. We had visited him in the hospital a couple times, so we knew what was coming, but this was our first real experience with death. So Allie and I wake up, still in a dreamy fog, and hear the news. And the first words came immediately from my younger sister. Before I could say sorry, Mommy, or wiggle over and give her a hug, my sister speaks up. You know, that's okay, Mommy. He's up in heaven, singing with the children. Nothing could have been more true. If you remember from All Saints Day, talking about my grandfather, he loved to sing and loved teaching kids to sing. My mother loves to tell that story because Allie said exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. A 5-year-old was the place for my mom to find the resurrected Jesus when she needed him most. She didn't run to a church or even a pastor right away. Her daughter had spoken to her words of endless comfort. I'm sure each of you have stories about when you had an unexpected encounter with Jesus. For Jody was found by Jesus when she was sitting on those limestone steps, sitting against the outer walls of the church. The men in today's story were found by Jesus as they were walking down the road. Nobody was expecting Jesus to be where he was, and yet Jesus seems to have found each of them and each of us anyways. Today we hear that we are invited to become more open and artistic in finding Jesus in the everydayness of life. Instead of being held back like Cleopas was, like Jody was, like you and I often are, instead of being held back by expectations or doubts or what we think we know, instead of being held back, we get to have our eyes opened. We begin to start to see the ways that the Spirit of God is with us, in us, and among us. In a walk down the road with your friend when you're totally bummed out. In a friend you're only just getting to know who listens while you talk about your struggles on the steps of a church. In the words your kids say to you at just the right time. In these and countless other ways, Jesus shows up in our lives. He finds us and is present in the unexpected, ordinary times and places. Emily Dickinson, of all people, seems to have understood this. Her words seem appropriate for us as we go on our way today, letting go of our expectations of where to find Jesus, and instead embracing the creative ways that Jesus has already shown up. She writes, "Who has not found heaven below will fail a bit above. God's residence is next to mine. His furniture is love. Let it be so."